Well, it has been some time since I shared with you a chapter of my story. Perhaps when you hear this chapter, you'll see why I had such writer's block about it. I call it, it is chapter 10, I call it The Visit. So here it is. One of the difficulties I've had with this chapter is that I have absolutely no recollection of the event. Whether faded with time or neatly scrubbed by my own brain to protect me from the memory, I cannot tell. Nonetheless, the visit Kate and I had is a critical inclusion to my narrative. To piece it together, I talked with Kate and had a long discussion with the woman we met that day. We bundled Chad up and began the journey about 2 hours ahead of our meeting at the home of the prospective foster parents on a sunny Saturday afternoon. We took the 50-mile trip to the city and then wound our way east along a rural 2-lane road for several miles. As most of our time together had been for the previous several months, there was no real discussion as we traveled. In retrospect, we might have exchanged many thoughts and ideas. After all, we were taking Chad to meet his potential caretakers. What would we tell them? What might we ask about their care of children? How long had they been foster parents? Did either of them have any background in medical or pediatric care? Had they cared for children with severe physical challenges? I have spent months trying to reconstruct who I was then. My most prominent sense of that time is numbness. Why had I wiped this chapter from my brain so completely? I had distanced myself. I felt disconnected, and part of that disconnection was that Chad's condition was intractable. There were no good solutions. Nothing about him was normal, nor would it ever be. I struggled with my lingering anger. The medical profession had handed us this burdensome child. I felt caged. There was no way out. But another part of my numbness was my total lack of dialogue about Chad with Kate. She had withdrawn from me months before when I saw the dim, dark reality of our future, and she still held out hope. My grumblings had only made her withdraw further. In hindsight, her reaction makes sense, but it did not then. And in that silence, as the silence grew, neither of us sought out the other to formulate a shared plan. Each of us stared into the future alone. Our silence that day was no different from the months we had spent alone together under Chad's dark shadow. The rural road onto which we then turned was mostly paved, but had become potted and worn from years of farm trucks hauling grain from adjacent fields to the elevators in town. The road was channeled between these fields along newly cut wheat and barley crops on either side. At the end of some fields, it made a tight 90-degree turn as we passed from one rectangular field to another as the road roughly paralleled along the Missouri River. Finally, we began to descend near the river to a horseshoe cove of houses wrapped around a large park-like playground. At the far corner of the park, we finally arrived at our destination, a 1930s bungalow-style home. As we walked up to the house, Barbie, our child coordinator, met us at the door and ushered us into a spacious living room. The room was alive. Barbie introduced us to Mona, a large woman easily as tall as I am. Her rounded figure matched the soft oval of her face and her large, kind eyes. There was a self-deprecating air about her, which corresponded well with the nurturing, grounded countenance she exuded. These are our children, Jacob, who is 10, Mark, now 7, and Michael, soon to be 6. And this is Arnie and his sister Julie, who have been with us since last spring. You kids can go outside now, play in the park and away from the pool. And Jacob, keep an eye on the little ones, will you?" With that, the kids neatly filed out the door, but could be heard whooping it up as they raced onto the tree-lined playground across the road. When the room settled, Barbie introduced us to Mona's husband, Burl, a squarely built man with an equally rectangular face bounded by a flurry of tight blonde curls. He barely spoke, but gave me a firm handshake while looking me squarely in the eye. I have learned over the last 40 years that his quiet awkwardness then was just the way he was. Quiet, solid, and honest. Barbie pulled up a chair. Kate and I picked a bench along the window across from Mona and Burl, who had settled into an overstuffed brown plaid couch. The living room was basic 1970s, with a quaint and well-used fireplace, shag carpet, and splashes of orange, gold, and olive green highlights. It felt warm and homey. "It's really curious," Barbie began, "that both of you couples have the same last name. And it is not a common one like Smith or Jones. Are you related in any way?" "My Cutler side of the family came here via Michigan and North Dakota," I offered. "We have been in the state for about 50 years, and most of us either farm or are in the implement business." "My Cutler grandparents came from Ohio and have been here for about 30 years, Burl quietly responded. We compared names of paternal great-grandparents and nothing matched. If we were at all related, it was probably in some distant and unrecorded past. "It is helpful for the department to know that you have no family connection," Barbie noted. "Mona and Beryl, what you might note up front is that this child placement would be voluntary, unlike other children you have had over the past decade who were removed from neglectful or abusive families. If we decide that Chad is a good placement for you, they will be able at any time to take him back home with them. Kate, perhaps you would share with Burl and Mona some things about Chad and talk a little about the care you are seeking and what it might entail." "Well, let me introduce Chad, our son. He is now about 1.5 years old," Kate said as she showed him to Mona and Beryl. She then talked about Chad's trauma at birth, the challenges of caring for him, and his feedings and medication. Mona asked about how often he needed special care and about his sleeping patterns. Throughout our meeting, Chad occasionally fidgeted, twitching with petite seizures. Kate cradled him as we talked and rocked him reassuringly to calm him. "May I hold Chad?" Mona asked. Kate and Mona both stood, met in the middle of the room, and carefully made the exchange from one nurturing pair of arms to the other. Mona sat back down with Chad, but he almost immediately began twitching through another series of small seizures. As Kate had done, Mona held him closer, gently rocking him. He settled again as we continued to share information and respond to the topics suggested by Barbie. As we left the meeting, Barbie walked us to the car. "We will talk it over with each of you this next week. If Mona and Burl are interested and feel they are able to take care of Chad, or if they decide it is not workable for them, either way, I will let you know." Kate and I drove home quietly. Kate may have felt hopeful about our encounter with Mona and Beryl. If she did not share it. Obviously, there was nothing to talk about if they decided not to take Chad. We would simply continue to seek some avenue by which we would continue. There is no way for any of us to truly know what transpires when people cross paths. What magic is it that works one time but not in others? After months of trying to find anyone who could help us with Chad, I held no special anticipation that this meeting had been any different. My numbness about Chad and his relationship with Kate and me had become pretty encrusted. I no longer felt involved in how we would care for him. I had virtually given up trying to manage the problem as I saw it then. I was a person professionally invested in finding solutions for people on a daily basis. But there was no solution for Chad. He was a problem I could not fix. I had no comprehension then that there was nothing that needed fixing. As Kate and I had grown distant, and as she had become more and more protective of him, a wall had developed between us. Kate was firmly in charge of Chad, and I had been unable in any meaningful way to even penetrate her thoughts about him. It took me many years to recognize how very differently we approached life and the challenges we faced. In all probability, meaningful dialogue was not possible. At the time, however, I felt I was in exile. And yet I could not imagine my fragile child being away from us. I could not envision anyone else providing the nurturance he so desperately needed. I could not, nor would I significantly care for him myself. But at the same time, I could not and would not willingly relinquish his care to others. I have relied on these pivotal women to fill in my memory gaps. Recently, Mona shared with me that having the same last name had been meaningful to her. If this story were fiction, sharing the same common surname would be just too implausible. But in our very real world, Mona was looking for some kind of divine guidance in considering whether to take on this huge task. She had seen our shared name as a positive sign. But when she held Chad, there was a profound shift. As she rocked him, she looked down at him, and he smiled at her in his infectious and engaging grin. She was smitten. Kate and I had no way of knowing it then, but Mona and Chad had in that instant magically bonded. So, that's chapter 10. I do appreciate sharing it, and thank you for all your comments and support. I will be less time between now and the next chapter. Thanks for watching.